Acid Horizon listeners, thanks for tuning in again after a short break. The podcast has some exciting news. From this month onward, in addition to our regular podcast, we will now collaborate with the new Zero Books to create a video series called Zero Books Archives. It's a retrospective of the Zero Books catalog, which features works like Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism and Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet. Furthermore, through Zero, we will be collaborating with other folks in the philosophy media sphere, such as John from the Horror Vanguard, whom we had on the show recently, and our buddy Labor Kyle, as well as a few other familiar friends. Subscribe to Zero's YouTube channel to check out the interviews, video essays, and other featured content coming in the new year. Now, on to our Q&A with the rest of the crew. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Here we are at the end of 2021. It is December, and we're doing a Q&A episode to kind of get back up on our feet. We were on hiatus for a couple of weeks because I was in the midst of a move. The others were in the midst of writing projects and doing things for their programs. But here we are to answer your questions. And the first set of questions that we have... Oh, and by the way, I have everybody here. I have Adam, Will, and Matt. Everybody's on board today. And what we will do is we're going to answer some questions that our patrons asked us first, and then we'll just kind of go down a list of other questions that we acquired from folks on Twitter and other places. So the first question regards Anti-Oedipus. And this is from JB, who's a patron of ours. They say, in Foucault's introduction to Anti-Oedipus, he refers to psychoanalysts as poor technicians of desire. My question is, what role, if any, do you see psychoanalysis playing on the left? And I'll give it up to any one of us, other than myself, who wants to take a stab at that.
Foucault's relationship with psychoanalysis was always complicated. For the first 10-ish years of his career, he was kind of interested in existential psychology, existential psychoanalysis, Binswanger, Dasein analysis, movements like that. Post the History of Madness, obviously his tune changes. When it comes to the question of psychoanalysis, I kind of want to flip it. I don't want to say necessarily that psychoanalysis itself has to play a role in politics. I think maybe one way to talk about it, and psychoanalysis is one way to get to this, even if they are poor technicians, is what role does desire have to play in the political, and what role does the political play in desire? And I think that the psychoanalytic framework, though limited as both Deleuze and Guattari, Foucault, R.D. Laing in some sense later in his career in The Politics of Experience, but that's generally more with clinical psychology and talk psychiatry, it can allow us different avenues of attack on the way in which desire is directed and structured. Obviously, Foucault's preference is going to be for a psychoanalytic approach that doesn't put desire at sort of an essential position or something that emanates at the root of a subject, but instead a discussion of pleasure. So maybe what the answer would be is psychoanalysis can be one of a litany of mechanisms to understand the political structuring of desire and the way in which we understand the history of how we've pursued pleasure as an art, as a way of life, and so on.
My reading of Anti-Oedipus has always been that it's not straightforwardly against psychoanalysis per se. It's certainly criticism of it, a critique of it. But the way they try to understand it is to say, at least in my reading of it, my understanding, it's not that psychoanalysis misunderstands how desire appears to us today. In fact, it correctly identifies it. It correctly identifies not only that, but also many of the mechanisms that are going on here. But what Anti-Oedipus is trying to do is bring it to a point of its own autocritique, right? To show that even if desire does in fact show up this way, this can only be understood in determinist historical circumstances. And that in many ways, and this is why it's also sort of a book of political philosophy, as they call it, is to show that this is part of how capitalism works, right? That these structures which psychoanalysis in some sense sort of discovers, I suppose you could call it, right, are ones which serve very specific functions under capital. And so the question, in a way, I think would be, or the way of thinking about it might be, you don't have to throw a baby out with the bathwater on this one, right? You can read psychoanalysis and learn very important things about how desire functions under capitalism, just as long as you are aware that there's a reason they're criticizing the institution of psychoanalysis. Because as an institution, in Deleuze and Guattari's view, what it does is not just understand what's going on here, it reinforces it, right? It pushes desire into these sort of blockages and these restrictions and so on and so forth, right, which have these political consequences. So we can sort of, I guess, this is how I read Anti-Oedipus in particular, is we can read Lacan and Freud and so on. And they will tell us a lot about how desire works, often in accurate ways, under capitalism, right? And that's sort of the key thing. So it needs to be phrased or understood in that historically informed sense, I would say.
So psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis is actually quite a broad church, same as the left. So I'm just going to try and give some examples of what can be useful for politics. But of course, by saying politics, I mean my own political sort of values and where that ends up. And so in that sense, the answer to the question is yes, because, for example, Zemmour, the guy running for president of France, his latest speech, I mean, it's textbook fascism in the sense that if you pick up Wilhelm Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism, you'll find a picture of Zemmour staring at you reading it. In that sense, that book as a psychoanalytic text will always be relevant until it isn't relevant anymore. And then I don't know, maybe you can have some sort of peace on earth or something, but unlikely. But the other risk I think there is too is redeploying psychoanalysis without bringing it to its autocritique, as Matt said. And so I think maybe psychoanalysis needs its own kind of internal, not so much a revolution in the sense of new institutions of psychoanalytic research. I'd say in a sense more of an insurrection. But in the sense we take away the peri-power structures that make psychoanalysis an institutional body that re-medicalizes different concerns and creates monsters like the DSM. Although, not a monster, actually. I think one of the best books about this is Paul B. Preciado's Can the Monster Speak? When he talks about sort of the roots of the sexual categories, or the categories of sexuation being rooted in colonial experiments and colonial forms of ideology, which really don't stand up anymore. So any insurrection that would involve psychoanalysis has to be itself an insurrection within psychoanalysis. And I mean, that's quite a big project, but it has to really expose the risks, the sort of psychoanalysis you're working with. I mean, Wilhelm Reich, great place to start, but he was a poor technician of desire in that sense, he thought you could shoot it out of a gun and take down UFOs with it. I mean, you can shoot desire out of a gun, in a sense, but not quite in the cloudbuster way. So there's a danger, but overall I think there's some very promising points of entry into psychoanalysis, such as Wilhelm Reich, such as Paul B. Preciado, because they're doing an auto-critique of psychoanalysis. And critique we're thinking of here, especially in the Deleuze and Guattari way of doing things, it's actually very German. It's like Kant's critique of pure reason. Anti-Oedipus is an anti-psychoanalysis in the same way that Kant's critique of pure reason is not a critique of reason, so he's anti-reason. It's more of an investigative aspect of seeing the limits and seeing the ways in which you interact with those limits when it comes to psychoanalysis as a method of knowing things.
Perhaps the one thing that I would add to that is I would investigate poor technicians of desire. Why is it the case that psychoanalysts are poor technicians of desire? I would say that we could chalk that up to either ignorance or unwillingness to circumscribe the entire scope of how desire is constructed within the social field. Freud is credited by Deleuze and Guattari as having made this major discovery of the unconscious, but clearly he doesn't go far enough, and Matt had already touched on that point. But one thing that Deleuze and Guattari also point out is that here we are in 2021, and psychoanalysis is not, I don't think, is the front runner in terms of psychological modalities, self-care modalities. And what we have is a passing on of that mantle or pieces of it to other disciplines and other forms of therapy. In some sense, we have support groups, we have collective forms of therapy. Things that even Guattari had experimented with are now maybe abundant or robust in certain sectors of the medical discipline. But I think about my experiences working in a school, for example, and the emphasis put on self-care and the inherent limitations of that modality to critique the institution, to the point of being able to reorganize it or to critique the social conditions in such a way that a school could become a radical node that could upend the forces of capital, the forces of domination, and so forth. So in that sense, that not only psychoanalysis, but many forms of therapy fail miserably at doing so. But Will, you had something else to add.
Yeah, Guattari makes a great point towards the end of his career, I believe is when this was written. And he says that it's important for the practitioner to determine whether the position one occupies will or will not contribute to overcoming the realities of segregation, social and psychological mutilation, and whether one will at least be able to minimize the damage. So it takes a certain kind of discipline on the part of the practitioner that both Foucault in works like Psychiatric Power and Abnormal, and Deleuze and Guattari point out that practitioners fail to engage in time and time again. We also see it in R.D. Laing's Politics of Experience, or The Divided Self, rather. In the first 50 pages, right, the exposition on the interaction between the patient and the practitioner, and the practitioner's unwillingness to actually read the patient in his own words. So it takes a recognition of one's own position, of one's own possession, or at least position in relation to psychiatric power.
So the quote is, poor technicians of desire. And he means at least two things by that. And I just want to sort of clarify that before we move on to another question. So on the one hand, they're technicians, and this is important, right? So I'm 99% certain it's towards the end of Anti-Oedipus, but 1% thinks it might be what is philosophy, where Deleuze and Guattari write explicitly that desire in this form, which psychoanalysis in a sense discovers, is produced and manufactured and regulated in this way under capitalism. It is manufactured and distributed and so on and so forth, right? In a relatively deliberate way in many cases, right? And this is also why, of course, we're going to lay the blame at the feet of the institution of psychoanalysis, right? Because they also become the sort of enforcers of this, right? So on the one hand, they're technicians because they basically alter how desire works. But it's sort of, you can't use the word really in a sense, but a natural sort of creativity and openness. Technicians are altering it. And they're poor technicians. And this is the other key thing, precisely because desire always finds it weighs out, right? It always escapes the ways in which capitalism, psychoanalysis, and so on seek to try and constrain it. Maybe not every single person individually speaking, but on the whole, if we look at a society, we can always find forms and areas where people's desires are essentially escaping the trap that they have been, this prison they've been put within, basically. So the poor technicians of desire thing has at least those two meanings. So I just wanted to sort of say that as well.
So our next question is from patron Max. They ask, who are your favorite interpreters of Nietzsche? And they're concerned about, there's many different interpreters at the forefront of many of our minds, like Jung, Bataille, Deleuze, and so forth. And so we'll go down the line. Maybe we'll start with Adam first this time, then Will, then Matt, and then I'll register mine. Go for it.
Okay. I mean, I'm not particularly that clued up with a lot of the secondary literature on Nietzsche. I mean, I kind of like to just get into the text and sort of rip what I can out of it, and then see what I can do with that, see where I can take it. But I mean, the Asaphal papers on Nietzsche are always quite fun. And it's one of those early sort of landmarks of French Nietzscheanism. And where it differs from someone like Deleuze is where they bring in the reading of Dionysus as obviously quite more of a negational figure. And they take it from Walter Otto's work on Dionysus, which they publish a little bit of in the Asaphal journal, I believe. Also, another one is Deleuze, because it's just so inventive. That sounds very patronizing. Yes, it's very inventive. I'm not fucking marking Nietzsche and philosophy. It's just an amazing sense of trying to exposit. Given that Nietzsche seems to come across as so anti-Hegelian, anti-dialectical, how does he do it? And the reading of Nietzsche as a response to critique of pure reason, I mean, the idea that Kant always gets the results he already wants. He does a transcendental argument. He argues backwards, say, okay, we have this. what structures do we need in place to have this? It only works if you value the kind of structured experience that he's trying to justify. And he uses it in the sense of a value metaphor, in the sense that he uses a legal metaphor to structure the critique of pure reason. And so for that, I refer to Deleuze's Nietzsche quite a bit, even when we're not totally in agreement. I'm going to say Heidegger's 4-volume reading of Nietzsche, it's pretty good. I mean, there are some parts, even to some extent, which is quite surprising for Heidegger, given his notebooks, that he actually sort of disavows the idea of a kind of a sort of a biological or racial reading, at least in the sort of more 1930s sense, of parts of Nietzsche in that text. But also it does get particularly good when it comes to his later work in what is called thinking. He makes a particular allegiance between Nietzsche and Schelling. What else? I mean, if you like genealogy, Raymond Geuss has to be done. I'm also a big fan of Lacerdo's. Sorry, I couldn't say it. No, I'm not a fan at all. Stalinists get fucked.
Will, what about you?
I'm going to take maybe some people will spit on me. Twitter won't like this. I like Emma Goldman's reading of Nietzsche, the baptism of Nietzsche as like a kind of anarchist. I know the Marxists on Twitter, and frankly, most of the anarchists will be upset. But I read quite a bit of Goldman when I was in college, and didn't touch it for a while, and only recently got back to it. And honestly, Goldman's reading of Nietzsche is like so refreshing for how poetic and also accessible it is. Obviously, Nietzsche Genealogy History by Foucault is great, but it is essentially like a deep dive into the philology of Nietzsche, and it is a lot of work. Just to read that essay is like, it requires a remarkable grasp of the German language too. So Foucault's work on Nietzsche that is explicit, I think, is tough, but it's rewarding. If you're interested in precisely Nietzsche's relationship to the concept of development and origin, and to temporality and continuity. But again, it's heavily philological. So I'll say like Goldman and Foucault are the two that I think I'm appreciating right now. But obviously Deleuze, Klosowski, all of them.
I think Deleuze almost goes without saying. It's just a fascinating sort of rereading of Nietzsche. But for me, and I don't know how sort of popular he is in sort of academic circles on this. I think he's quite well respected. But I've always really enjoyed Bernard Regenster on Nietzsche. I think he has a number of merits. He's an analytic philosopher, and he writes like an analytic philosopher, but he does engage with people. Deleuze, I think, is mentioned in both of his most recent books. He explicitly talks about it and says that there's a lot of overlap, he thinks, with his reading of Nietzsche and Deleuze's reading. But they just focus on different areas, I guess. And so you get some of the clarity of that sort of analytic approach in the prose that he uses. It's very clear and it's very concise. But for him, the analysis of Nietzsche centers on the problem of nihilism, but it's nihilism which sort of starts on the ontological level. That's his reading of Nietzsche. It's not particularly controversial, but he explains it very well in his books. Following, the death of God, as he calls it. Of course, the problem is that a metaphysical system of God, a Christian God in particular, and God at its center, the rest can't hold without that. You can't just take God out and then keep the rest of it, right? And so the problem of nihilism essentially presents itself in a number of different ways in Nietzsche. There's at least 3 ways in which Nietzsche thinks you can sort of respond to that, all of which are sort of a variation on nihilism. And so he then starts talking about the will to power and the eternal return, and then so on, as ways of thinking through this question of how do we orient ourselves, practically speaking, under these modern conditions. And I found it really refreshing. I also think it's an excellent introduction to Nietzsche in general. You can just sit down and read Nietzsche, I think, but almost anyone can, although it helps to have a bit of understanding of what he's critiquing. Bernard Register's book, particularly, it's called The Affirmation of Life, Nietzsche on Overcoming Nihilism. I found that to be a really, really useful book for people who are unfamiliar with Nietzsche, but want to get a big picture of what's going on here, what's Nietzsche's basic sort of concern, what are some of his big concepts and ideas. And so, yeah, and he's got a more recent book, but I haven't had time to have a proper read of that yet. I've only read the introduction, but Bernard Register is very good. On the one hand, he writes like an analytic philosopher, so that has both the virtue of clarity and conciseness. Also, it can be a little dry at points, but he does engage also with Deleuze and other sort of continental readers and suggests some connections and points of agreement as well. So if people have read Deleuze, then you might be interested in having a look at him too. I've always liked him.
We've said almost everybody, so perhaps my rundown top 10, Deleuze number 1, probably Foucault number 2, Klosowski number 3, and all of the honorable mentions include Emma Goldman. Also, I'd actually like to add one of my former professors, Charles E. Scott, has some great work on Nietzsche. A book called The Question of Ethics is definitely worth looking at. And another book, The Time of Memory, if folks are interested for a more phenomenological reading of Nietzsche. And why do we love Deleuze? Well, I think one of the biggest reasons that I could give for loving Deleuze's interpretation of Nietzsche is that he actualizes, and I think I've said this in previous Q&As and other places, that Deleuze actualizes the priorities of Nietzsche's philosophy, which is an interpretation that does not seek representation, but an articulation of aspects of concepts in Nietzsche's thought to create something new. And I think Deleuze is successful in his mission in doing that. With that said, shall we move on? We have another patron, Chris, who asks, what are your favorite philosophy quotes? And is there any that are worth getting a tattoo of? And this time, maybe we'll start with Will this time.
I'm not against the apparatus. I'm just a bit allergic from Foucault's security, territory, and population, when a bunch of students were putting recording devices at the front of his desk. Because the rooms were so packed whenever he would lecture at the Collège de France, they changed the time to 9 o'clock so that most French undergrad and graduate students wouldn't go. A little game to play to make sure that those who wanted to be there got to be there.
Matt, what about you?
I've always liked two quotes or ideas by Adorno, which I've always seen as being quite similar to each other. So he says, behind every work of art lies an uncommitted crime. And then also at another point, I think this does link together as well. You can cut this out. So he says, talent is perhaps nothing other than successfully sublimated rage. And I've always sort of thought, I suppose, as sort of two interlinking components. There's this idea that the artist is sort of perhaps in some sense unstable, or there's something that they seek revenge upon, or an anger at work there, but it's sort of finds expression in a less violent and destructive form, instead in a creative, productive expression. So I've always liked those two quotes. And Adorno has a real way of, Minima Moralia is this whole series of aphorisms, but every sentence is just golden. And there's also one by Foucault. People know what they do. Frequently they know why they do what they do. But what they don't know is what they do does. And I love that. It's sort of, on the one hand, it's like needlessly, complex, and like
it's so Deleuze-Foucauldian, right?
But the kernel of truth is there, right? The idea that this is sort of Foucault's project in a way, right? Is like people know what they do, and they even know why they're doing it. But the question is, what does it do, right? What's the function of this, right? That's the real question for Foucault. So I've always liked that as well.
Adam, what do you have queued up?
There's obviously going to be a few Stirner quotes in here. They are a bit cringe to some extent, if one cares about that. Obviously, the downfalls of peoples and nations will invite me to my rise. Lovely bit of poetry right there. My favorite one about insurrections, of course, which is, revolution is aimed at new arrangements. Insurrection leads us no longer to let ourselves be arranged, but to arrange ourselves, and set no glittering hope on institutions. I always quite like that one. It's like a destituent power summarized in a sentence. And then you've got the great old quote from Hegel, where he says, if someone tries to measure your skull like a phrenologist, he says, the retort here, properly speaking, would have to go to the length of breaking the skull of the person who makes a statement like that, in order to demonstrate to him in a manner as palpable his own wisdom. Yet a bone is nothing of an inherent nature at all for a man, still less his true reality. So I quite like to save Hegel from some of his more phrenological later times when he was hanging around all these Kantians.
I got two of them. These are highly retweetable quotes. I don't know if you can have them tattooed on your body, maybe as a back piece. But the first one's from Arthur Schopenhauer, and this is just such an apt quote, especially if you live in the United States. But it's applicable everywhere, and I think it's also relevant in the wake of all the folks who are agitating for a nationalistic socialism or a patriotic socialism, as was a recent trend on Twitter. The quote goes like this: The cheapest sort of pride is national pride, for if a man is proud of his own nation, it argues that he has no qualities of his own of which he can be proud. Otherwise, he would not have recourse to those which he shares with so many millions of his fellow men. The man who is endowed with important personal qualities will only be too ready to see clearly in what respects his own nation falls short, since their failings will be constantly before his eyes. But every miserable fool who has nothing at all of which he can be proud adopts as a last resource pride in the nation to which he belongs. He is ready and glad to defend all its faults and follies tooth and nail, thus reimbursing himself for his own inferiority. And you just have to love Schopenhauer. I mean, he's just killing you.
As long as some of those quotes are from On Women.
I think it's somewhere in the collected essays, if I remember correctly.
Not a nice guy. Very, very nasty.
And then, of course, the other quote that I love is by Deleuze's, that there's no such thing as a left-wing government. He's talking with Claire Parnay, and he says, well, I will tell you that there cannot be any government from the left. It doesn't mean that there's no differences between governments. The best we can hope for is a government that would be in favor of some of the left's requirements, but a government from the left, that does not exist. So how to define what it is to be from the left? I would say in two ways, and it goes on from there. And if you want to find out more about that, you'll have to look at the ABC Dare series, and that's available on YouTube. And I think we'll probably talk about that again at some point in the episode.
That'd be a good episode to do.
Oh yeah, you could do one episode on each letter. So anyway, let's move on. We have one more question from a patron here, Guillermo. Do you have any advice for someone trying to publish a book of philosophy or critical theory, specifically in terms of finding the right publisher for one's text or what it entails to write an appealing and convincing book proposal? Maybe we don't all have to answer this one, but anybody want to take a stab at that?
Nepotism. It's not a meritocracy at the end of the day. I mean, all kinds of crap gets published at the end of the day. Sometimes it is a matter of nepotism. I mean, it's also, but I mean, I guess one of the best ways to talk about this, it's not so much, it's not as nepotistic as publishing a book, although it's a similar idea of making a pitch, and that's the idea of a PhD proposal. And you have to start presenting a pitch that's both philosophical in terms of showing the scope of what you're going to contribute to the conversation, laying out a rough sort of skeleton of it, or at least an abstract, and tailoring that to the kind of, you've always got to tailor it to the audience. If the funding board aren't all philosophers or experts in your field, you have to kind of reduce it to the kinds of questions and the core philosophical problems that you're answering, and gesture at how you could do that within the space of, a year or so, or how many years you need to get to that, get to where you're going there. We're not philosophy publishers. We're not particularly clued up on this sort of thing at the end of the day. But I do, like with any creative industry, there's just such a level of nepotism to all of it. So there is a degree of luck. I mean, publishing is not a meritocracy. I mean, as Stephen Jay Gould once said, he's less impressed by the contours and composition of Einstein's brain than the certainty that many people of equal or higher ability have died working crap jobs or exploited or enslaved in other parts of the world. So there is undeniably an element of luck to this. Nepotism and a simply collection and access. But if you want to secure that, I guess just getting one's name out there, creating a body of work such that you can sort of bank a kind of karma, although that's by no means certain, maybe something will happen. I mean, none of this is guaranteed. That's the awful aspects of the creative or the writing industry or the philosophy industry. I mean, to go back to our Larouelle episode, philosophy has a capitalist kind of structure, and it reproduces itself and reproduces the kind of various different ways of doing philosophy in its own image. And so I think those are the struggles of doing a philosophy text, or writing a critical theory text. It's on getting the time to write it and the support to write it, but finding a place to sort of publish it when there's so many people writing, and also so many closed avenues by sort of social milieus and their sort of connections.
I would add to that, it probably follows the same general rule as submitting poetry or submitting an album to a record label. you need to be reading the journal. You need to be reading the books, the chapbooks that are published by that publisher. You need to be listening to the albums on that imprint or on that label so that you know whether or not your work is going to be well situated among them. And it probably behooves you to become conversant with some of those authors, at least in your own work, and understand what they're doing. And as with anything else, it takes just a lot of commitment. So to be a writer and to write a book as a one-off, sure, you probably can do that. But when I look at who is successful, whatever, I don't even know what the model for success is, in philosophy, other than like you write an interesting philosophical book. It may get some exposure, it might not. But at the end of the day, the people that I find to be most successful are people who are writing regularly, whether it's blog posts or some kind of essay response, and their focus seems to be dumped into that. I mean, I think of Matt Colhoun, for example, and even Adam here. I mean, these guys just write, so prolifically, and they dump a lot of their time into it. You really have to generate a discipline around writing. And I think ultimately in the end, to produce something of quality that's worthy of being read by others and worthy of being accepted by yourself, what does that come out of? That comes out of practice.
Or you could be Slavoj Žižek and just repeat the same old shite again and again. Or you could be like Agamben, right? So have enough prestige, but you got enough prestige, you could release these very good, like 10,000 or so word, 10, 15,000 or so essays, and they get published as books. And then, essays have their own merit because you can publish an essay as a book, really. It happens all the time. Just a shorter format, yeah.
And then blog post twice and blow it all up.
It's the form is itself exploding. It's hard to give any sort of prescription. For some of the more institutionalized places, they only receive manuscripts in the form receivable to them. So you need to be stamped with, the right in-group statuses, and it's just it's not right. It's the nature of the capital industry. That doesn't mean it can't be changed, not at all.
So here's a great question. This just comes from somebody on Twitter. What does it mean to do philosophy for you?
I don't think I can say ultimately what the purpose or motion of philosophy is. I mean, they can do plenty of philosophizing. I'm not going to do just one activity. In the way it's conducted mostly in the academy today, there is it's a proliferation of a career. It's a kind of self-capitalization somewhat, and something, let's be honest, a lot of us, I mean, it's very enjoyable in some aspects to go with Francois Lyotard on it, because there is a sort of desire to do philosophy that makes it quite pleasurable. But of course, I'm talking about philosophy within their own context. There have been many other philosophers who probably haven't sat down in the same way. We get so many philosophies also through the oral tradition. And just think about the privilege of writing, the privilege of teaching, and how those sort of forms of doing philosophy have taken precedence, and sort of what they presuppose. I mean, if I wanted to give something, I would say at least an either active questioning or an unraveling of presuppositions or of givens. Essentially to let the immediacy unfold a little bit, or to take an immediacy to its limit. There's something excessive, I guess. But overall, it's as soon as one says what philosophy is, I don't want to risk becoming the kind of almost sort of explicitly kind of imperialist that you would see in some of the German thinkers.
One task, at least, of philosophy we could say is to understand the world in order that we can change it. Right? That seems like one reasonable way in which philosophy can be conducted. But I think one of the reasons there's this strange kind of snobbery towards particularly existentialism and a few sort of related like writers and thinkers, which you find in sort of the high levels of academia in sort of the sort of Anglo-American world. So sort of looking down on it as this sort of public philosophy, as a common man's philosophy, or whatever it, And I think part of it is that these philosophies actually touch on the questions that real people actually care about. And so sometimes I think there's a sort of professional jealousy of the professor who works on philosophy of mathematics and they've written 4 books on modality and no one buys it, right? And then this guy comes along and writes a book on Sartre or Nietzsche or something, and everyone buys it. It's not real philosophy. It's like literature. I'm not sure if there necessarily is a definitive answer to what is philosophy, but I just had this thought as I was hearing Adam that, yeah, there's this strange attitude towards certain forms of philosophy which engage with people's actual concerns. And so, it's a sort of cliched answer, again, in a way, but perhaps part of philosophy is us learning to learning how to live, or at least to deal with the world sometimes. That's why we come to philosophy, is like they have questions about how should we live. I think that's okay as well. I don't know if there's one answer to what philosophy is or how it should be done.
No, I agree. The way in which we like discard existential, like Gordon Marino's book, I think is a great example, right? The way in which like graduate students like collectively said, this is nonsense, right? But it's meaningful to people. For me, I'm just gonna do the Craig thing. I'm just gonna steal from Deleuze. Like, I'm just gonna say, for me, it really is concept creation. And I fail at it all the time. Failing at concept creation to me is central to what the philosophical process for me is. It's an identification of presuppositions that I believe to be at least papered over or hidden in something that I'm reading or something that I'm writing, the identification of that, and then coming to terms with it through the process of concept creation. And for me, that's a creative process, and it's an outlet for me to understand the world. I mean, like whatever it may be, but for me, it always has to be fundamentally a process of recognition and creation, however that might look. So I'll be early Deleuze when I say that like people like Proust can be philosophers and so on, like Raymond Roussel can be philosophers. I'll be somewhere between Proust and Science and what is philosophy there.
I'm just wondering if at this point Matt wants to revise his answer one more time.
I mean, I obviously would. I obviously would like another go at that. We can leave it an open question. We can leave it as an open, ongoing question, right? Is there really an answer here? Is there an answer? I don't know.
It was great.
Let's find out as we read philosophy.
I will be the final speaker, and so I will offer the final and true answer to this question. What does it mean to do philosophy for you? Well, I think first of all, even for me, there's multiple meanings for philosophy. And I believe one of the things that philosophy allows us to do is create a space for multiple ways of doing philosophy. It allows for various contenders of what it means to think to enter into a space. Thinking about Platonic dialogues, we have a question coming up about that, and how Plato is very prejudiced to a very specific kind of question as being the philosophical question. Questions like, we think of like, what is philosophy? That is a philosophical question. But what about questions like, when is philosophy? Or where is philosophy? Often those don't register as a kind of philosophical question. For me personally, in the sort of Marxist vein, of course, to change the world. But I think the event of thinking itself, and, kind of in line with what Adam and Will were saying, and what Matt also affirmed, is this, this unraveling of presuppositions, just the gift of philosophy as that moment in which we're able to transform or redirect all of the intensities that are called thought and create something radically different and to think differently. And often that event appears to me in my life as a moment of repose, a kind of ecstasy almost, a stepping out of the regular, everyday, normal flow of things and having this radical and unique experience. And so for me, that's one of the meanings of philosophy, is to enjoy the vitality of that moment. Also, to find people with whom you can share a discourse that's often pretty annoying to other people, right? Like it's rare in real life, to be able to assemble, 2, 3, or 4 people to talk about the same thing at the same level of interest and readership, and to create and conduct a discourse like the one that we're having right now. So that is something to me that's very precious. And so, to even be able to do this podcast and to have a listenership besides, that's something that I don't take for granted. So that's very meaningful to me.
Also, just to add in one final thing, because Craig mentioned the when, the where, the how, like that's one of the merits of Deleuze, right? Because if we ask a question like, what is philosophy? What we're doing, we're presupposing a particular view of this, right? We're presupposing that there is an essence to the thing to be understood. And sometimes it's a matter of taking a step back, and as Craig said, thinking about other questions we might ask of this thing we call philosophy, right? Rather than trying maybe to distill down the essence of this thing. Craig's right. Maybe there's something to pursuing those sorts of questions, like where's philosophy? I like that idea, Craig.
So we have some fun questions. One question here is Emo Foucault, literally Jeff Magnum. Will, do you want to speak to that?
I can neither confirm nor deny that I live in Georgia, that I am the genius behind On Avery Island, or in the aeroplane over the sea. But I will say that I do appreciate walking along a wall of flowers, and that occasionally, sometimes semen does stain the mountaintops. But beyond that, I have no comment at this time.
He also loves Jesus Christ.
We have one more question here. Actually, this comes from our friend Jeremy R. Smith, renowned Laruelle scholar. But I'd like to actually open this question up. You know, I'm a bit older, and I thought my days of playing video games were done until Jeremy's like, you got to try Hollow Knight. You know, it was during the pandemic. I had a lot of free time, and that was an excellent game. So Jeremy has this question here. It says, where is it? Will you ever do a Hollow Knight lore video? And what are your predictions for the sequel, Silk Song? Well, I'll say this, is I love playing Hollow Knight. My wife, she loved watching me play Hollow Knight. We're excited about Silk Song. It comes out in February. I think, Matt, you are also a Hollow Knight enjoyer.
It's one of my favorite games of all time. Yeah, probably top 3.
Yeah, like I've played a few minutes of Hollow Knight, but I keep getting chat every time I like start a conversation with Matt on like Discord or Telegram or whatever, and we're video chatting at 3 a.m. I can only go like 15 minutes without him telling me I have to play Hollow Knight. So maybe what I'll do is once all this nonsense with applications and so on is over, I'll sit down and I'll live tweet my experience struggling through Hollow Knight.
I think I told you guys, I recently finished playing Apotheon. Am I pronouncing it right? The Greek game. It was so fun. So I recommend, like, if you're looking for a cheap game on Steam, I had a really good time with that.
Yeah, and honestly, like, it's stuff like that where it almost feels educational because you're immersed in a particular, I don't know. I love that game.
Well, it sent me to Wikipedia once or twice. So,
that
I mean,
rocks.
it was worth it.
Yeah, no,
yeah.
awesome.
So,
Well, I mean, if we're going to plug video games, I might as well spend like a minute saying, it's a free game. Get it on Steam or on itch.io. It's called A Bewitching Revolution. And it's essentially a game about being a witch who helps educate people in basically using sort of Silvia Federici and a lot of autonomous communist literature. You throw some Molotovs, you give houses to the homeless, you start community kitchens where you help people start community kitchens, and you teach people how to do this for themselves. It's only an hour. It's got a nice synthwave soundtrack. It's very like life affirming. It's a good time.
I feel so bad because I referenced like a return to tradition kind of game, and you recommended like a proper left-wing game.
There are no left-wing games.
Craig is accidentally revealing his counter-revolutionary mindset, his bourgeois psychology, as Lenin would say.
I'm not a counter-revolutionary. I'm just glad I'll be shot first.
All right, what do we got? We have here, this is a great question. What is your favorite Platonic dialogue? And we'll start with Will for that one.
God, that's tough. It's a toss-up for me. I'm not going to do the one that's been most important to like my quote-unquote scholarship or whatever, because like that always changes. But the one that I find the most enjoyable to read, it's a toss-up between Euthyphro and Crito. Like there's a strange beauty in watching Socrates. Also, if you are interested in like Acid Horizon and the dialogues, one of my favorite episodes, if not my favorite episode, is on the Phaedrus, very early in our time with Taylor Atkins, and it's just a beautiful discussion. Craig brought in some stuff from Deleuze and Derrida, and Taylor obviously just brought Taylor and that wealth of knowledge that he has. But yeah, for me, it's the Euthyphro and Crito, one of those two.
Okay, Adam, what about you?
Okay, well, my favorite one's a little bit of a hipstery one. It's the Larkies, which is a dialogue on the notion of courage, because it was one of the first ones I ever really got into, and it really does display the Socratic method and the sort of the new ways of knowing that it's trying to present pretty interestingly. I mean, there was this paper I read at the time, and it's Norwegian names, so my pronunciation might be a little bit crap. It's Eivind Rabus, and her paper on the Larkies and the idea of Socrates is challenging a fundamental mode of knowledge based on paradigms and trying to replace one with definitions. Obviously, you can have paradigmatic definitions, but for Socrates, it's not enough to give examples of courageousness that people can then participate in and use to get the sense of a rule, almost like the paradigm as a schema. Rather, Socrates doesn't want rules to make sense. He wants these fixed principles that are defined and set in stone to some extent, away from the actual experience of this virtue as it plays out in real life. And I think that opens up a lot of the main problems with Plato and Socrates. You're going to find in people like Nietzsche, obviously Deleuze, to some extent in even Kant, particularly Kant and Hegel and Schelling. The idea you need a schema for knowledge, the idea that you don't just need, if you do need rules, it really need a sense of the rule to link sensibility, immediacy, and the higher levels of the concept. Otherwise, they're going to be completely ungrounded, completely, Kant says, blind. Not exactly, by far, no means the best term. It's obviously ableist discourse, but it's directionless, which is not the same as blind, but this is obviously an error on Kant's part.
So my sort of undergraduate education of Plato was almost entirely like a sort of reading of Republic. So I'm not actually that familiar with all of Plato's dialogues, but I remember really enjoying the Meno. On the one hand, I appreciate the way they talked about virtue, and the idea is, how does someone acquire virtue, they say? Is it taught, or is it in some sense innate, or is it learned through practice? And I remember really appreciating that discussion. And there's also this challenge, this sort of, what does it mean, or how does one search for a thing when you don't know what it is that you're searching for, right? Unless you know the thing you're already searching for in advance, right? It's this sort of like meta level questioning into the character of questioning itself, which I guess Heidegger also talks about. For me, I'm mostly familiar with the Republic, which I really enjoyed. But probably a Meno for me.
Those are dialogues, and they have some of the best interlocutors. Like, Glaucon rocks. Like, Glaucon's hilarious.
I remember reading about Leo Strauss has this reading of Republic where he says that basically it's a satire. The Republic is actually Plato trying to say, look, let me show you what happens when you just like sit down and abstractly try to work out the ideal configuration of society. You end up with this like bizarre, like communistic but poverty-stricken philosopher kings and all the rest of it. I think that may be an unfair characterization of Strauss's reading, but I always liked that. I always found it an interesting and funny approach.
Yeah, the possibility of parody is really important to Strauss's reading.
Yeah, Plato wasn't materialist enough.
Probably my favorite series of dialogues are the Theaetetus, Sophist, and Statesman. And among those, probably the Statesman stands out the most. I did some writing on the Statesman in college. Actually, John Salle has a book on the Statesman, which I have yet to read, which I heard very good things about. But what I like about the Statesman is, for Plato, it's a moment of humility. It's one of the aphoretic dialogues. At the end of it, we can't determine what, based on the method of division that Plato conducts, we cannot find who is the true philosopher versus the sophist. And one of the reasons I really like that is that the figure of philosophy in Plato's work remains elusive in that dialogue, despite everything else. We talked about earlier what Plato thinks the goal of philosophy is. What are the most important questions of philosophy? And when it comes right down to it, Plato cannot find that figure. And so I can appreciate that, because I think I think what we see in the Statesman is an act of concept creation, in his method of division. It's also marked by these sort of detours into myth that are really odd. I mean, they seem very unphilosophical in some ways, but very creative in other ways. So there's a burst of creativity coming through various seams in the work, which I think speaks to what philosophy really is, which is a creative event. And it happens amidst a kind of failure. And so in that sense, philosophically speaking, I think the Statesman as a dialogue is redeemable as such, as a kind of failure, which reveals the impossibility of circumscribing a true philosopher, within a set of definitions. And it also shows the limits of this methodology that's underpinned by a search for true identity. So I can appreciate that. So here's a question. Where does Marx feature in Deleuze's historical trajectory of the fundamental question of political philosophy fighting for servitude as salvation, going from Spinoza to Reich? Did it really take Wilhelm Reich to rediscover that? If so, what was missing in Marx's philosophy? And this should be an interesting set of answers. Is Matt chomping at the bit, or does, no, it looks like Adam is. Adam, you go first on this one. What do you think is missing in Marx, if anything?
I mean, that question is situated along the lines of desire is a product, subjectivity is a product, and Marx gives us a good tool for this by showing us the relations of production as they really are. That's fundamentally, I mean, does Marx attempt to answer that question himself? I mean, there are so many texts of Marx and so many scraps of notes. He probably did at some point. That's probably the case. But we do have one determined answer in which he did think about this, and that's the 18th Brumaire. And in that text, no, he didn't. He whined like a little bitch about it. And then he came up with the idea of a lumpen proletariat. He may have discovered it better than he knew at the time. And I think in many ways he almost certainly did. I'm not saying Marx's analysis of capital is wrong or anything. It's explicitly very much firm and correct. But in terms of rediscovering that question, he rediscovers the frustration because he's doing an imminent critique of his own historical conditions, and history is a load of failures. It's a slaughter bench, as Hegel put it, especially in continental Europe in the mid-1800s, as not only as places but also there, but also continental Europe as an expansive imperialist project, which caused even more misery and death and genocide outside of it. He would have been in the best place to discover it, but really he gets it at its most highest intensity. And when it comes to that challenge to respond to it, at least in that instance, he could have rediscovered that question, but he didn't. Catastrophically so. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
So one of the reasons why Marx is so important to Deleuze and Guattari is that, so I think in once in negotiations and another in the interview that Deleuze gave with Negri. On one hand, I think in one of Negri, he says that Anti-Oedipus was a work of political philosophy from start to finish. And then in the former interview, he says that it's political philosophy, I think, insofar as any work of political philosophy needs to turn on the analysis of capitalism. That sort of needs to be a starting point in Deleuze's view. And if the question is, how do we understand capitalism? Well, you simply have to go through Marx, right? There's no other way of trying to get to the core of it, in my opinion, and clearly in theirs, right? So that's sort of how Marx figures into it for them, I think, is the analysis of, sort of the dynamics of capitalism. Whereas they may want, of course, they revise or eliminate certain other elements from Marx's analysis. I don't have an answer on the right thing, but I just wanted to say that, yeah, for Marx, it's because they think political philosophy, which is what they take themselves to be doing, has to center on capitalism. And if that's what you're doing, then you need to be engaging with Marx, even if they're going to end up revising, critiquing elements of it and so on. So that's how Marx figures into it, I think. And also Guattari's like his actual political experiences, right? His time as a sort of Trotskyite sort of militant, and probably first and foremost a communist, but also a Marxist in many ways. So Guattari brings his experience, and Deleuze brings, I think, the theoretical importance of his analysis of capitalism.
Will, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think the work of two French theorists, Guéry and Deleuze, show that there is a kind of function of the subject and the body in Capital. I think Foucault's reading of Marx in the chapter Docile Bodies, which we have a concept and focus on, shows that there is a subject in Capital, but there is no processes, there are no processes of subjectivation, at least in that first volume, that they can hang their hat on. So what Deleuze and Guattari do, I think that's really effective, is actually to just take the mechanisms of productive, the productive capacities of capital, and move it over to the unconscious and just say, no, we'll just extend ground. And it produces an extraordinarily remarkable both critique of psychoanalysis that I think is so different from Reich's, which is just you should also consider psychoanalysis, and here is why. For Deleuze and Guattari, Marx and the philosophy of the unconscious sort of necessarily collide because the ground extends into each other. So the process of production is extended to the process of subject production through desiring production, frankly. But yeah, so I would say that, like, Craig, you have that catchphrase that I'll let you say about Marx and Deleuze, but I think that that's the fundamental element at work in at least that element of Deleuze and Guattari's politics. I think there's a space for discussions or the non-positionality of the subject, right? Althusser and Foucault are going to break pretty extensively there. So there is this question of the function of the body, desire that is actually present in Capital, but actually Deleuze and Guattari are necessary for that final linkage to be made that isn't bound up in all of the problems of the history of Freudo-Marxism that we get in Marcuse and Reich.
I just want to go back to the question really quickly, because the question asks, where does Marx feature in Deleuze's historical trajectory? And I kind of stand between Adam and Matt on this one. I think Matt hit the nail on the head. And this actually goes back to Todd McGowan, too. I don't think there's a critique of capitalism that has surpassed Marx for any of the failings that it might have. The challenge, however, and Marx was unable to see this because he didn't live into the 20th century, was that a set of historical conditions emerged which paved the way for fascism. And it put a demand on thinkers of that time. If Marx did presuppose that contradictions would mature to the point that the working class would finally say, you know what, enough of this, we're taking over from here. Something happened in the 20th century, which, completely contradicted that. And so from a philosophical standpoint, you have Reich asking this question, like, why is it the case that the workers aren't rising up? Why are they leaning back towards these reactionary views? And, this is the importance of Deleuze and Guattari, because one of the things that was not factored into the political economy, or maybe was not developed adequately, was either the notion of ideology, or how does that notion of ideology play into the political economy in the form of desire. And so, in some ways, I see the question almost answering itself, but I think the finer point that I want to put on it is, I don't think Marx's analysis of capitalism has been surpassed. And even though Deleuze and Guattari dispense with some of the concepts that Marx originally works with, they ground their fundamental premises about the nature of capitalism on Marx's analysis.
Yeah, in a certain sense, though, too, and Deleuze's contemporaries agreed with, there is no historical analysis that can skirt around conveniently Marx.
No.
Marx constitutes an advent of a particular understanding of production among human beings, right? It's not just an analysis of capitalism. It's a capacity to recognize its force in a way that isn't, again, bound up in the population management of the physiocrats. It's a completely new way of understanding the way in which we actually just interact with each other. And we did an episode with this on Engels, and we talked about the problems there with Engels' shift on questions of alienation and so on. But I think that's the point. You cannot, it featured historically, the problem is it's a question of history. And Marx is a fundamental breaking point.
Great. I think we have one more question that we'll do, and I know who's going to weigh in on this. The question is, does Hart and Negri's concept of the multitude adequately include less digitally, infrastructurally advanced spaces of the empire? If so, how exactly? And while we're at it, I'd also be interested in a critical appraisal of Hart and Negri's use of biopower vis-a-vis Foucault's idea of it. And so for this, we will start with Matt.
The resident Hart and Negri defender has logged on. So I think the first question is relatively straightforward. I think the answer is yes, it does adequately take this into account. And it's actually central to them that it does. Their account of the international economy is deeply informed by an engagement with feminist, post-colonial, post-developmentalist theorists. So what their approach ends up looking like, and I think they note this in one of their later books, their understanding of how sort of the international sort of capitalist economy works ends up looking very similar to Immanuel Wallerstein's. And so the idea is that, yes, they're going to talk about the so-called post-modernization of the economy. But what they're interested in is the way that transformation takes place, yes, in the most, let's say, sort of technologically highly developed parts of the global economy, sure. But of course, one of the key things for them is that the factories, the production of physical and manufactured goods doesn't go away, right? It's reterritorialized and therefore enters into a relation of power, in particular, when considered on a global scale. So they're also very, very sort of interested in the ways in which the post-colonial literature and feminist literature and so on is going to help us understand what's going on here. If we look at the mineral exploitation, that happens often on the African continent and so on. These are questions they're really sensitive to, and often they go out of their way to try to think about this. And yes, as Will's just sort of pointed out to me, we have an episode on the chapter of empire, the postmodernization of the economy, which I still think is a really, 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 really good episode. The second question I think is a little bit harder, and I think Will's going to have some views on this. But there's an essay what I honestly just wanted to sort of quote a passage from. So the essay is called "Acting Up with Hart and Negri: Capitalism in the Biopolitical Context," and I may mispronounce the name, I'm afraid, but it's Emra Karakilic. They have a really good explanation of this, because basically Hart and Negri are going to distinguish between biopower and biopolitics. Now, one initial point, of course, we can say straight away is, well, Foucault doesn't necessarily distinguish in this straightforward way. And Hart and Negri know this. Like, they're not saying this is what Foucault said. They're aware that they are doing something a little bit different from what Foucault's doing, right? But there's a passage here from this really, really, very good essay which explains it. So I just want to read one paragraph and encourage people to have a look at it if they're interested in what Hart and Negri do with this concept of biopolitics and biopower. Recognizing that power in Foucault is always double, Hart and Negri invite readers to reconsider the concepts of biopower and biopolitics. The authors argue that history cannot be understood merely as the horizon on which biopower configures reality through domination. There always flourish spaces of confrontation against the power that is imposed on subject, that is, the power over life. In other words, a power that administers and produces life is continually confronted by a resistance which derives from the desire to feel, think, and exist differently. This resistance activating desire is defined as power of life. And so there is a difference to them, and biopower and biopolitics end up taking on slightly different sort of inflections, but I don't know if Foucault is going to agree with. Basically, it comes down to, and this is the final sentence of this passage, so the biopower is power over life, and biopolitics is the power of life to resist and determine an alternative production of subjectivity. So they see a kind of two-sidedness to the question of biopower and biopolitics. There is this repressive element, but there's also this resistance and creative component as well. It's been pointed out, there's problems with this reading. It's certainly not accurate to Foucault's initial intentions. They're relatively well aware of that, but I think they think that there's certain issues of ambiguities that Foucault himself runs into in the way he characterizes these concepts. It's not something I've delved into in too much detail, but I found that essay to be quite helpful. So, firstly, I recommend that people go and read it if they'd like to learn a little bit more about that. But also, I'm curious what Will's take is on this. Weigh in.
I mean, so this is obviously a longer conversation we have to have, because it would take us another hour to go back and forth on where I think Negri and Hart misstep on biopolitics as a force that can be applied, because I think the question then comes down to what the function of the population is. I've read that essay. I do think it's a really good description of because I know Hart and Negri can be complicated in their later works on the position biopower has in there and biopolitics has in their work. So I do recommend it as well, even if you don't agree with the conclusions that Hart and Negri come to. It's just a great resource. But I think that this idea that one can apprehend systems of population management in an affirmative capacity, that is just biopolitics. That is going to end in the same power over life at the level of the population. So we have to distinguish. I think the failure here is to distinguish between what made kind of biopolitics this thing that can dovetail with disciplinary power with a new apparatus that is medico-juridical, but also driven by statistics. So it's a question of scaling. It's a question of of what it means to affirm life, whether one can affirm life through the framework of biopolitics. Biopolitics already does affirm life, right? By making some lives more livable, by allowing certain people to remain on ventilators. Biopolitics already functions to affirm life. It necessarily acts as the justification for why through affirmation we must negate life. So it is already productive, right? It produces populations, it manages them, it proliferates them. So this idea that they've noticed or created a positive and negative distinction in biopolitics, I think I have an issue with. This will have to be like a longer discussion, but I think that it's already there in biopolitics and it's already part of the problem, which would be my answer. Maybe we'll do a longer form episode where you and I can just talk about this, but for now, that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, and I would also need to read more about it as well, because I read a lot of Hart and Nagby, but the questions of biopower and biopolitics aren't necessarily my focus. So, yeah, I mean, I think Will makes some really good points there, and it's been pointed out about Hart and Nagby a number of times. I do think my impression is that they're not simply arguing that there is like there's a good biopolitics where we just don't do the bad things. I don't think that's probably where we're going to go with this. I think my assumption is they're going to try and take it in the direction of asking the question of the way of how it is that people can, in their own lives, produce new forms of subjectivity which escape this repressive force. But I don't know if that's necessarily.
Yeah, but I think that always has to move towards an escape of the biopolitical. That always has to move towards going astray, which biopolitics fundamentally cannot allow.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And maybe we should do a discussion about that at some point. But yeah, if you're interested in like how they approach it, this essay, but definitely worth a read. We have the other episode on the postmodernization of the economy as well.
Okay, let's do the last question. I think this is a good way to end, and anybody can pick this up. How significantly has the podcast changed or solidified personal views for you all, and how has it affected your other projects?
I mean, yeah, it's remarkably changed my life. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about the listeners and they rock, but also like meeting the three of you has been extremely informative. I wouldn't know a lot of the work that I wouldn't have been exposed to a lot of the work that's like fundamental to like, not just my like philosophical whatever, not like a lot of the stuff that we've done has changed the way I view my life. And this commitment to the three of you, to this project, I think is something that I'm not experienced. And it's been a life-changing experience for me. And I don't mean that in like it's this grandiose, wonderful thing. No, it's just knowing the three of you and knowing that there's like someone out there who's got this on is like fucking horrifying. But it is remarkable that there are people who are willing to support us in what we do. So yeah, no, it's changed me there. But on my views, I would say my politics have shifted because of this, but in very specific ways. Like our engagements with biopolitics, for example. Like I was probably much more, if not sympathetic, at least receptive to a negriest approach to these things. And slowly through dealing with all of these texts that we've had, I've moved away. My interpretations of the function of the biopolitical, for example, have changed. But also, like, I think that I value metaphysical inquiry more and the role that it plays in grounding the political. I think I undervalued that. And also, I've seen the value in taking up figures in the canon who sometimes get papered over in academia, like Benjamin Fontaine. Fontaine, I think, is a great example of that. Existential Monday was a remarkable paper that, though existentialism being one of the things I spent a lot of time on in college and early grad school, I would not have been exposed to otherwise.
I find it hard to know exactly how far my views have changed. I mean, podcast itself has just been enormously positive. Like I've learned a lot by talking to these three guys. I've also, like, talking to Will, I think, has opened up to thinking much more and trying to engage more with literature. Because Will, of course, does a lot of work on disability and disability theory, and I've learned a lot about that talking to him and being given some pointers to go and read certain things, and I found that really helpful as well. Beyond that, to my views, I really don't know. I mean, I certainly went through about a 6-month period, I think, where I was really into Tikkun and the Visual Committee and things. And I think I sort of set like Adam and Will onto them in a way. And then the more that those two get into it, I'm starting to drift away from that again. So maybe that's one of them. But it's sort of cemented the thing for me that I really value Deleuze and Guattari's sort of overall approach. I've always found that really helpful. I mean, these sort of episodes of discussions. So yeah, I don't know. I just like being exposed to some of these new viewpoints from like Will and Adam and Craig. Like Craig has like a lot of interest like psychology and psychoanalysis and things. So I like talking to him about that.
Okay, well, in terms of how the podcast has changed me politically, I mean, for one, I don't want to say politically because politics at the end of the day is what you end up doing, and I'm still very much sat in my armchair for a lot of things with teaching duties or stuff like that. But in terms of broadening my sense of reading, absolutely. For one, just thinking about Deleuze, vegetal studies, particularly disability studies. I mean, in the edition of the paper I'm doing, it should be out with the Cleveland Review of Books at some point. It was a critique of Agamben on the pandemic. Although not necessarily as critical as one may think. I sort of literally just link Will's blog in there, like, this is the place you should go get started. That and Shelley Tremaine is like incredibly helpful the entire way, especially understanding the particular imperial medical death machine is the United Kingdom, which has been great. No, sorry, United Kingdom's never been great. It should be, I've said it before, the existence of the UK is not a left-wing position. But overall, speaking to these guys has always been incredibly formative. It's become like a weekly, if not bi-weekly commitment of basically every day speaking. It's almost like a long-form psychoanalysis sometimes. It's also been incredibly enriching. Meeting some of the listeners, of course, I mean, in the seminars and online, and even talk to them in comments. I'm not going to praise all the listeners because I know Nick Lang could be watching this, and I mean, I've got nothing good to say about the man. That's simply it.
The end.
So there's no need to praise the abstract listener, but when I have met them, they've always been fucking sick. Always been fucking sick going out with, always been sick to talk to, and it's helped build a kind of community around it. And it has never exceeded to the point of, you know, a kind of the awful thing people call fandoms, which is why we don't have a Discord server, because very dangerous. Bad apparatuses. Yeah. But overall, huge fun doing this, huge fun broadening my horizons, reading about all the time. I mean, reading things I wouldn't have to read usually because I'm stuck in an 1840s bar in Germany listening to Max Stirner, Feuerbach and Bauer beat the shit out of each other verbally. So it's good to get out there. It's good to sort of broaden one's horizons, and also it broadens the scope of what one thinks is possible. I mean, even just looking at Deleuze, you do, okay, what do I want with life or politics or political goals? And then immediately, if you try to get like an analysis of how desire is produced, maybe we can work on how to desire better.
So you've been at you've been in the position, Craig, of having to like herd the stray cats that are 3 graduate students all across the world.
That's right.
I'd imagine this process has meant quite a lot to you. So why don't you close it out?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, a lot to say. I think just very simply, the one thing that doing this project does, and I'm going to actualize my philosophy here by uttering a command word to the masses, which is do a podcast, do something like this, because it makes philosophy that much more tangible. Like even interacting with people like Taylor and Coop online, you know, philosophy, it's always been a part of my life, but there's a sense in which it's felt somewhat remote, maybe even something somewhat shameful in a way, like, oh, I don't want to show this to my parents or this group of friends over here. But now there's such a massive group of friends and acquaintances that I feel utterly validated in doing this. And as I said, it makes it that much more tangible. Everything I read now, there's this sort of like hovering sense of accountability. How am I going to communicate this? How do I respond to this, especially if I'm asked about it on a podcast? And that kind of accountability can be very exciting, very enlivening. And so for that, I'm very appreciative. I underestimated the success of this podcast from the very beginning. I knew that it was going to be good, but I didn't know that it was going to be popular. And that is another gift, because by dint of this becoming popular, well, now it has allowed me to do these other opportunities like with Zero Books and what have you, and move away from my previous job. Also, I'm in my 40s. And so being someone in their 40s, this is often a time of life where if you have a family, maybe you're drifting away from these kinds of projects. I'm leaning in harder than ever. And so that's really cool too. If I could break off a piece of that and just share it with anybody else who has that kind of vision or wants to feel that level of richness in their life that philosophy produces, at least for me, by all means, take a piece of it. As far as political views are concerned, I'll say this. I feel emboldened because this was empowering for me. It allowed me to do something like quit my job, and walk away from something that was meaningful to me, but in doing this and in creating something with a group of people that was very rich, not only emotionally, but intellectually, I was able to see the sort of paucity of resources that my job provided me intellectually and emotionally, so it gave me a ladder out of that. So that I'm also very appreciative of. In addition to that, more specifically regarding text, I was happy to have been introduced to Agamben. Like, I really didn't know his work that well until I got with the podcast and, reading more of Tikkun and those sorts of things. I think, politically speaking, even though, at my age and, with respect to where I live now, sometimes it's hard to actualize all the kinds of things that I did in the past. But I find myself, I don't know, I was very sympathetic towards like autonomia, for a lot of my life, at least, when I was doing activist stuff during the Occupy era and so on. I think I'm even leaning into that a little bit more heavily, whereas maybe I was going more towards a Marxist bend. I came flying back with a vengeance. So those kind of readings are really exciting to me and working on that. And I'll also say that just being able to do exactly what I said I was going to do. When I went into grad school on my application or on my personal statement, I said, I'm going to take philosophy out of academia and I'm going to put it into the world in a big way. I had this sort of like, grandiose statement. And I totally did, with the help of you folks, like there's just no doubt about it. So
you could have done it with any other internet Foucauldian. I don't know why you chose me.
I don't know. Well, that's the thing. We're star-crossed Foucauldians.
One thing I've realized I have an answer here, one actual answer. I've basically realized I need to read Laravel, and I kind of don't want to. He's really hard, okay? But I should read him. So I've learned that.
You were there for Jeremy's
Joe,
episode.
I'll do it one day. I will. One day I will read Laravel.
I'll have to say this. I was, my hackles were up the whole time that I was reading it, but after I read it, it like set in a day or two later and I came back to it and I felt better about it. A lot of philosophy is like that to me, where I'm just shaking my head no the whole time. And then, it's like listening to that Island Boy thing. Like the first time you're like, no way, I'm not listening to Island Boy. And next thing you know, you're singing Island Boy. Does anybody know what Island Boy is? I'm cutting that part out.